Hi everyone, so I'm going to be going over the materials from class 4. So today we're going to be reviewing how to measure behavior and differential reinforcements. So for our agenda today, we will first be reviewing time sampling. There'll be an activity as a part of your handout, so I'll go over how to complete that activity. Next, we'll be reviewing differential reinforcement. There'll be a second activity as a part of your handout, and I'll also be explaining that. At the top of your handout, as always, there's going to be a list of important terms for your quiz, and we will go over what each of those mean and some examples. As a friendly reminder, your assignment 1 is due on Friday, October 30th. If you have any questions about how to complete it, please come see me in my office hours. And also for my last week's discussion, I went over an example of how to complete the assignment, so please look at that as well. All right, let's recap with time sampling methods. So we learned about 3 different types of methods: whole interval, partial interval, and momentary time sampling. So for whole interval recording, you'll be writing it down if the behavior occurs during the entire interval. And as we remember, this can make this into an underestimate because it's so stringent. If the behavior at one point stops, then we don't mark it as occurring. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. For partial interval recording, we record it if the behavior occurs at any point during the interval. So this can be more of an overestimate because if it occurs at any point, we mark it even if it was just for 1 second. For momentary time sampling, if the behavior is occurring the moment the interval ends, then we would mark it. So I found some example videos online. I will admit they may not be the best videos, but I think it does do a good job of illustrating how these different measures would be recorded. So let's first look at whole interval recording. So in this example, she's looking at how is this person on task for during the whole interval. So as you can see, she has in the back where she's marking a plus if the behavior is occurring, and then she'll put a minus if the behavior is not occurring. So let's go ahead and watch this. So as you can see, during the first part of the video, she marked it as a plus because he was on task for the entire 5 seconds. However, at the end, because he was off task for even 1 second of that interval, she marked it as a 0, even though at the end he did start to get on task. So that's an example of whole interval recording. So next, we're going to look at partial interval recording. So in this example, the student who's in blue, they're looking for instances where he bangs his head with his fist. So if this happens at all during the interval, then you'll see that our recorder is automatically going to mark it. So let's go ahead and watch this. Behavior occurred. She's marking. Behavior did not occur. Behavior just occurred, so right away she's marking. And behavior occurred again. All right, and finally we have momentary time sampling. So for this one, they're also looking again if the student's on task, and as a reminder, she will mark it at the end of each interval. So for this one, she will say beep as an example, but normally you would be listening to the beep either on a watch where you can have it buzz, or maybe you might have headphones where it beeps in your ears, but we can talk about more about that later.
Ding! Ding!
Okay, so as we can see, each time there was a ding, she marked down if the behavior was occurring or not. And so in that other example, since he started to be off task right when the ding occurred, that's why she marked it as a minus sign.
Ding!
Okay, so for your first activity, you're going to be practicing these steps. So you have on your assignment on the second page, it's called Systematic Direct Observation Practice. And so when you're watching these videos, which I'll be posting online as well in a separate PowerPoint, you'll be looking for academic engagement. So this is defined as a student is actively or passively participating in the classroom activity. So some examples can be writing, raising hand, talking about a lesson, listening to the teacher, reading silently, or looking at instructional materials. Non-examples would be staring into space, talking about off-topic activities. So we're going to go over some examples of this. So for the first video, you'll be doing whole interval sampling. So if the behavior occurs for the entire duration of the interval for 30 seconds, then you would mark it. So I'm going to do 60 seconds total for this video. And when you guys are practicing at home, you can choose how long you want your interval to be. It can either be more or less time. So if you want to do it for every 15 seconds, you can look for that. Some helpful resources is to go on YouTube and look for an interval recording. So for this video, I'm just going to be pausing it. So it's not the most accurate way to stop an interval. But just for the sake of practicing, that's what we're going to do now, so I can explain how I would mark this behavior. So for this one, we're looking at this student who's in the stripes, and his name is Tyler. So we want to see if he is academically engaged for the whole interval or not. So let's go ahead and watch. So again, I'm going to be looking at this interval from a 30-second span, so he has to be academically engaged for 30 seconds for me to mark that it did occur.
Today, we are going to be using tangrams. Raise your hand if you've ever used tangrams before. Other classes? Some of you? Okay. We are going to be using them to be making some different animals. I have a little bit of a story that comes from China, and it's about where tangrams came from a long time ago. Tyler, could you put that book away so that I know you're listening? Please?
All right, so it's about 24 seconds. So again, sorry, normally you'd have a timer, so this would be more accurate. But in this case, we see that he takes out the book, so he begins to be off task. So we would mark that that he was not academically engaged. So now let's watch for another 30 seconds.
Long ago in China, a man decided to paint a square tile for an emperor. The painter used many beautiful colors, and he worked very carefully. One spring day, he finally finished. The tile was so lovely, the birds sang and the clouds danced. Carrying the tile very carefully, the man began walking to the palace to deliver his exquisite gift to the emperor. But on the way, the man slipped and fell. The tile hit the ground and broke into 7
Okay, so this is roughly 60 seconds. Let me play a little bit
pieces.
longer.
Just like what we now call a tangram. You have a tangram?
All right, so at the end of this 30-second interval, even though he was on task for most of the time, at the very end, he started to take out an item that he was not supposed to. So you would still mark that the behavior did not occur because this is the whole interval recording. So on my sheet, this is how I would mark it. So after 30 seconds, Tyler took out a book that the teacher asked him to put away. And then after 60 seconds, Tyler begins to take out a paper. So because of that, he was not academically engaged. So I put minuses for did it occur and then pluses for didn't occur because he was not academically engaged for the 1 minute interval that we were watching him. In the next video, you're going to be practicing partial interval recording. So remember for this one, if the behavior occurs at any point during the interval, you will mark it as a yes. So same thing for this one. I'm going to pause it after 30 seconds for my intervals, and we will see how this would be marked. So again, on YouTube, there's a lot of different recording devices that you can use to practice this at home. So I recommend watching the video and then also having the beeps going on in the background. That way it's a little bit easier for you to practice knowing what the length of the intervals are as well. All right, so let's go ahead and watch this.
Okay, so let's try and make Grandfather Tang's fox. I drew an example on the board. See if you can do it for my example. If you need a little bit more help, we can do it one piece at a time, but let's see how we do by ourselves first. Well, if you're going to stand, push your chair in so I don't trip over it or pull it over neck. Thank you.
Okay, so for this first 30 seconds, we saw that she was using her blocks and following teacher directions. So even though at the end of this interval, she starts to take out a book she shouldn't have been taking out, we'll still mark it as it did occur because we did see a moment of her being academically engaged. All right, so let's watch again for the next 30 seconds.
Ooh, we got the head. Head seems to be the easy part. I see lots of heads. We're working on tangrams right now. Let's put that away. Unless you can put it away or I can take it from you. Thank you. Okay, if you need a little help getting started, find that square.
All right, so another 30 seconds has passed. So we saw that for that interval, she was mostly off task. However, since she did have a moment where she started following teacher directions, we would still mark it as that she was academically engaged because she started working on the blocks again. So here's how I would mark it. So again, as I said before, after 30 seconds, she was working correctly with her blocks. So I'd put a plus for the academic engagement did occur and a minus for didn't occur. And then after 60 seconds, we would still mark it as a yes. Even though she was off task, she began working again when the interval was up. So it happened during the interval. So we would still mark it as a yes. She was academically engaged, and then a minus. So last, we have momentary time sampling. So for this one, I will be using one of the YouTube clocks. And so you'll hear a beep. So after every beep, we would mark down whether or not he is academically engaged. In this case, when he's academically engaged, it would be when he's sitting and quietly listening. When he's not being engaged, it would be when he's standing up. So I'll talk through how I am measuring it as the timer is going. And then we'll go ahead and start.
All right, for writing today, we are going to be doing an activity that involves you fixing a story that I have written. The way that I need you to fix it is by making it a lot more exciting because my story is really pretty boring.
Yes, he was engaged.
So,
interval just ended.
Who has some ideas for what kind of things make a story exciting when we're writing? Morgan, each sit down.
Yes, he's still engaged. Mark it in the interval.
Thank you. Tyler.
Verbs.
Verbs. What? Give me an idea of a verb.
Run, swim,
Because a verb is a what?
action.
Yes,
An
he's
action
still
word.
engaged.
Exactly. So you certainly want some action in your story. So people might be running or swimming. Okay. What else?
Adjective.
Adjectives. What's an adjective?
Describe something.
No, he's not
Yes, a word that
engaged. We
describes
see that he
something.
starts to stand up.
I need you to sit down, children. Please, you can't see.
Okay. So I called this student Jordan, but I now realize that maybe the other student was named Jordan, but that's okay. Just for the sake of this example, we'll pretend that the child we were observing was named Jordan. So for the first 15 seconds, as soon as the interval beeped, we saw that he was still sitting at his desk. 30 seconds is the same. He was still sitting at his desk. 45 seconds, he was still sitting at his desk. But then at 60 seconds, that's when Jordan started to stand up and he was no longer sitting at his desk appropriately. So for did it occur, I'd mark a plus for the first 3 intervals and a minus for the last interval. So you guys will be getting access to all 3 of these videos, and on your own you can practice these different types of recording systems. That way you can get a sense of how behavior might occur differently depending on which measuring system that you're using. So time sampling will be coming up in your quizzes, so let's go over some sample questions. So for example, in number 1, it says, in Paul's data collection method, he hears a beep every 15 seconds. At the moment of the beep, he checks to see if 3 target behaviors are occurring or not occurring and marks his data sheet accordingly. What data method is Paul using? In this case, the correct answer is momentary time sampling, because the key here is that he's looking at the end of the interval. He's not looking for if it occurs at all, which would be partial, and he's not looking if it's occurring for the whole interval, which would be whole interval recording. So for number 2, the question asks, during a parent meeting, the school psychologist tells the student's mother that she used a method of estimating behavior that usually produces an overestimate. What method is she most likely to use? So the key word here is overestimate. So we know that one of the time sampling methods that creates overestimates is partial interval recording, because we mark it any time it occurs, even if it's just for a short time. So it tends to overestimate how much the behavior is actually occurring. All right, so let's get into the next part of our session. So next we're going to talk about differential reinforcement. So let's go ahead and review the different types. So the first type is differential reinforcement of other behaviors. So that, for example, if a target behavior does not occur for a specific amount of time, if basically the child is doing anything else, then you reinforce. So as an example, if John doesn't bang his head on his desk during a 5-minute period, then he gets a token. So in this case, it doesn't matter what John is doing. John could be standing up, John could be writing, John could be talking to a peer. As long as he's not banging his head on the desk, then he gets a token. And this one is good, especially for behaviors that may be dangerous. At that point, you may want to focus on just reducing that behavior as much as possible. So then reinforcing anything that is not comparable to that dangerous behavior may be an effective strategy. Next, we have differential reinforcement of low rates of behaviors. So for this, if a target behavior occurs below a certain amount, then reinforce. So for this example, if John bangs on his desk 3 times or less, then he gets a token. So maybe John has been banging his hands against his desk multiple times throughout the day. And so maybe our goal is to not at first get rid of it, but rather to lower the amount of times he's doing it. Next is differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors. So this describes if a student engages in the behavior that cannot co-occur with the behavior we are trying to decrease, then reinforce. So for example, Mindy has a marker in one hand and a fidget toy in another for 2 minutes instead of hands and mouth, then reinforce. So like the example says, maybe we want to reduce Mindy's amount of time she puts her hand in her mouth. So if she's holding objects, then that's incompatible for her putting her hands in her mouth. For differential reinforcement of alternate behaviors, this describes if a student engages in positive alternative behavior instead of the problem behavior, then reinforce. So for example, if Jenna raises her hand 2 times in class, then reinforce. If she calls out once, do not reinforce. So when looking in actual behavior strategies, you will find that differential reinforcement of alternate behaviors tends to be the most commonly used strategy. However, all of these strategies may be appropriate depending on what behavior is occurring and what is the best strategy for reducing that behavior. So in addition to the types of reinforcement, we also want to consider schedules of reinforcement. So the first one is a fixed ratio schedule. So fixed ratio describes the fixed number of responses earns a reward. So for example, if I push a lever, every 10 times water drops out. So in this example, there's a fixed number of times I have to push the lever in order to get a reward. So same thing with if we are looking at an example in schools, maybe a child needs to participate 10 times before they get a reinforcement. Fixed interval schedule. So a response after a fixed period of time earns a reward. So an easier way to remember the difference between ratio and interval is that interval typically has to do with measures of time, whereas ratio has to do more with number of occurrences. So for fixed interval, an example is a rat presses the lever. After 10 seconds has gone by, he gets a reward. So in a school-based context, an example might be if Melanie is on task for 1 minute, then she gets an award every time that she's on task for a minute. So variable ratio schedule. So an average number of responses earns a reward. So here, a good way to think about this one is as a slot machine. So maybe after 4 pulls, you get an award, but then maybe the next time after 6 pulls, you get an award or win a prize. Finally, we have variable interval schedule. So this describes how a response after an average amount of time earns a reward. So for example, a rat might get a pellet for pressing a lever after an unspecified amount of time that averages 10 seconds. So for your activity 2, you're going to be considering both the differential reinforcement procedure and the schedule of reinforcement. So let's look at this first vignette. So in this vignette, the antecedent is for when Max is given a toy during playtime. His behavior is that he throws the toy at peers in the classroom. The consequence is then peers look at or yell at Max. So we can kind of guess from this behavior sequence that Max is gaining attention every time that he throws a toy. So he's using this behavior as a way to gain attention from his peers. So in this activity, first you're going to decide a differential reinforcement procedure. So for this example, I'm going to choose to do a DRA, so a differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. So for my example, if Max engages in positive alternative behavior, plays with his toy, instead of the problem behavior, throws, then he gets a reinforcement, which would most likely be attention from a peer or from his teacher. So for a schedule of reinforcement, I'm going to choose variable interval. So each time Max plays appropriately for a toy for 30 seconds, give attention, then increase this to 1 minute and continue doing so until Max continues to play with the toy appropriately for longer periods of time. So there can be multiple correct answers for how to go about this behavior intervention. As long as you can justify it, that's what matters, and as long as it's supporting the student's behavior. All right, so for your second activity, this is what's going to be on your handout. So you're going to be working on Alex. So the antecedent is when directed to work on math or a reading activity, Alex elopes from the classroom, or in other words, he tries to run away from the classroom. As a consequence, Alex escapes the math or reading activity. So with this sequence in mind, first you're going to decide on a differential reinforcement procedure, and then you're going to choose a schedule of reinforcement. So that's all I have for today's class. If, as a reminder, you do not have to turn in the handout, but if you ever want to go over your answers with me, feel free to email me or come to my office hours and we can discuss it. Even though this isn't going to be graded, I think this is really great practice for learning the different terms and also for preparing you for your weekly quizzes. All right, well, everyone, thank you so much, and I hope you have a great weekend.